mean I'll see it.
You know that feeling when the air just turns thin? Like the oxygen is being sucked out of the room right before something terrible happens? That is how that afternoon felt. Everyone was talking about the sky, about the once-in-a-lifetime event, but nobody was talking about what was happening behind the closed curtains of the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. We all have that one neighbor we don't know, the guy who keeps his lawn perfect but never says a word. We just assumed he was private. We didn't know he had a girl in there. He had her for 2 years. She was 16 when she vanished, just a kid walking home from a shift at the library, and by the time that sun started to disappear, she was 18, though she looked like she was 90. He kept her in a space that wasn't much bigger than a walk-in closet attached to a bathroom with no vent. That was her world. Cold tile, the smell of mildew, and the weight of the steel around her ankles. He was careful, usually. He was the kind of monster that thrived on routine. But that day, the heat was stifling, and he'd been drinking. He let her into the shower to wash off the grime of a week spent in the dark, and for the first time in 700 days, he fell asleep. She heard the heavy, rhythmic snoring through the door. It was a sound that usually signaled a few minutes of peace, but this time it was an invitation. She didn't even dry off. She just stood there, water dripping off her ribs, looking at the tiny, high-set window. It was a hopper window, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, but she had become so thin, so skeletal, that she knew she could fit. She used the edge of a metal soap dish to prying at the latch until her fingernails tore and the skin on her palms was raw and weeping. When the latch finally gave, it didn't make a sound. She squeezed through. The brickwork outside scraped the skin right off her stomach and breasts, leaving long, red streaks against the white siding of the house. She fell into the dirt, the chains around her wrists clashing together with a dull, heavy thud. She didn't have shoes. She didn't have clothes. She just had this primal, screaming need to move. So she ran. She hit the asphalt of the street, her bare feet slapping against the pavement, the broken ends of the chains dragging behind her like iron tails. The light was already starting to fail. It wasn't the soft, golden light of a sunset, though. It was something wrong. Something sickly. The sky was turning a bruised, metallic violet, and the shadows on the ground were sharpening into strange, crescent-shaped claws. She hadn't seen the sun in 2 years, and now, the first time she stepped into its light, the sun was dying. Imagine that for a second. You've been living in a hole, praying for the day, and when you finally reach it, the world is ending. The birds stopped singing. The wind just died. It became so quiet that she could hear the blood rushing through her own ears. She reached the main road, her heart hammering against her chest like a trapped bird. She was looking for help, but the street was eerily empty. People were inside, or they were tucked away in their backyards with those cardboard glasses, waiting for the moon to take a bite out of the sun. As the moon slid directly in front of the sun, the temperature plummeted. A sudden, unnatural chill settled over the neighborhood. The girl stopped in the middle of the intersection. She looked up, and even without protection, she saw it, the black hole in the sky where the sun used to be. The corona flared out like white, ghostly hair. To her shattered mind, this wasn't an eclipse. It was a sign. She thought the man had called down a curse. She thought the darkness was coming specifically to pull her back into the basement. That's when she snapped. The trauma of the last 2 years collided with the cosmic wrongness of the sky. She started to scream, but it wasn't a human sound. It was a guttural, wet rattling. She dropped to her knees on the hot tar, her fingers digging into her own scalp. She began to pull, her knuckles white, until clumps of her matted, dirty hair were ripped out by the roots, leaving her scalp a bloody, jagged mess. She wasn't just screaming anymore, she was clawing at herself. Her fingernails, already jagged from the window latch, found the soft tissue of her own cheeks and neck. She began to slash at her skin, desperate to peel off the layers of her captivity. Deep, red furrows opened up on her collarbones. Blood, dark and thick in the twilight of the eclipse, began to spill down her chest, mixing with the grime and the sweat. She looked like something that had crawled out of the earth, something ancient and punished. A man lived in the house right on that corner. Let's call him Arthur. Arthur was a quiet man, a veteran who struggled with loud noises and sudden movements. He'd gone out to his front porch to see the totality. He was holding a heavy, wooden baseball bat, something he kept by the door out of habit. When the sun went out, he saw her. From his perspective, he didn't see a victim. In that weird, silver-black light of the eclipse, the shadows play tricks on your eyes. He saw a pale, naked figure in the middle of the road, draped in chains, covered in blood, and literally tearing its own face apart. The way she was moving, jerking, twitching, letting out those rhythmic, animalistic shrieks, it didn't look like a girl. It looked like a demon. It looked like the manifestation of every nightmare he'd ever had. He shouted at her to stay back. She didn't even hear him. To her, he was just another shadow, another tormentor. She scrambled toward him on all fours, her chains clinking and sparking against the asphalt. She was moving fast, driven by a psychotic break that had completely severed her link to reality. She was reaching out with those bloody, claw-like hands, her eyes wide and rolling in her head, showing only the whites. Arthur panicked. It was a total lizard brain response. The darkness, the cold, the sight of this gore-covered creature rushing him, it triggered something deep and defensive. As she reached the edge of his lawn, she lunged. She wasn't trying to hurt him, she was trying to grab onto something, anything, that felt solid in a world that was dissolving into shadow. But Arthur didn't wait to find out. He swung the bat with everything he had. The sound was like a wet bag of flour hitting a concrete wall. The wood connected with the side of her head, right at the temple. Her skull gave way with a sickening, crunching pop that echoed through the silent street. She didn't even have time to moan. Her body just folded. She hit the grass, her limbs splaying out at impossible angles. One of her eyes had been displaced by the force of the blow, and it stared up at the eclipsed sun, unblinking. The blood soaked into the manicured lawn, looking almost black under the silver corona of the moon. Arthur stood there, chest heaving, his hands trembling so hard the bat fell from his grip. He looked down at what he'd done. And then, as the moon began to move, as the first diamond ring of sunlight broke through and illuminated the world again, the illusion vanished. The monster was gone. In its place was a girl. A tiny, malnourished, broken girl with rusted chains around her wrists. He saw the scars on her back. He saw the way her ribs poked through her skin. He saw the look of absolute, pure terror frozen on her face. He realized then that she hadn't been attacking him. She had been begging. He called the police, of course. They found the house at the end of the street. They found the basement. They found the man who had kept her there, still asleep in a drunken stupor, unaware that his prize was lying dead on a neighbor's lawn. The guy went to prison for life, but Arthur was never the same. He didn't go to jail. It was ruled a tragic accident, a product of extreme circumstances and a perceived threat, but he might as well have been in a cell. Every time there's a clear day, every time the sun is bright, he can only think about that silver, sickly light. He can still hear the sound of the bat hitting her head. And the worst part, the part that sticks in my mind whenever I think about this story, it's the chains. When the paramedics lifted her body, they noticed that the skin had actually started to grow over the metal on her wrists. She had been wearing them so long they had become part of her. She died just a few hundred feet away from freedom, killed by the very world she was trying to return to. It makes you think twice about the people you live next to, doesn't it? And it makes you realize that sometimes the timing of the universe isn't just a coincidence. Sometimes it's a cruel, cosmic joke. kind of silence that happens right before the world goes wrong. It isn't the absence of sound, but rather a heavy, pressurized stillness that makes your eardrums feel like they are being pushed inward by invisible hands. I lived in that silence for a long time, tucked away in my unit at the far end of the hallway where the carpet always smelled like damp wool and old cigarettes. I've struggled with things for most of my life. The voices aren't exactly voices. They are more like a low-frequency hum that tells me the geometry of the world is slightly off. Most days, the medication keeps the hum at a level I can ignore. But when the sky started to change, the hum turned into a scream. Everyone was talking about the eclipse for weeks. They were excited, buying those flimsy cardboard glasses and planning viewing parties on the roof of our building. I stayed inside. The light coming through my blinds was already starting to look sick. It wasn't the golden hour glow you get in the evening. It was a bruised, metallic silver that made the shadows in the corners of my living room look like they were vibrating. I sat on my sofa, watching the way the dust motes danced in that dying light, and I felt the last of my grip on the real world just snap. It felt like a physical click in the back of my skull. Suddenly, the hum was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. I understood, with a terrifying certainty, that my neighbors weren't people anymore. They were glitches. They were stains on the fabric of the building that had to be scrubbed away before the sun disappeared entirely. If I didn't fix it before the total darkness hit, we would all be trapped in that amber twilight forever. I went to the kitchen and grabbed the heavy, wooden-handled cleaver the first usually used for frozen meat. It felt right in my hand, heavy, balanced, and cold. I didn't put on shoes. I wanted to feel the grit of the hallway carpet under my feet. I wanted to be connected to the bones of the building. I stepped out into the hallway just as the moon began its final crawl across the sun. The light out there was even worse. Everything looked like an old, faded photograph, drained of all warmth. I walked to the door directly across from mine. I knew a young couple lived there. They were always laughing, always playing loud music that vibrated through my floorboards. I knocked. Not a frantic knock, just a steady, polite rhythm. When the guy opened the door, he was wearing those stupid eclipse glasses on top of his head. He looked confused, then his eyes dropped to the cleaver. He didn't even have time to yell. I stepped into his space, the movement fluid and natural, and buried the blade into the side of his neck. The sound was wet. It was a thick, heavy thud followed by the sound of a fountain being turned on. He slumped against the doorframe, his hands feebly clutching at the spray of hot, dark red that was already soaking into his white t-shirt. I pushed him inside and closed the door behind us. His girlfriend was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she packed a cooler. She turned around, a smile on her face that died so fast it looked like her skin was sliding off her bones. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. The clarity was so loud in my head now. I caught her by the hair before she could reach the balcony. The way her scalp stretched, the sound of the hair tension, it was visceral. I brought the cleaver down across her throat with such force that I felt the blade notch into the bone of her spine. She fell silently. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a clock and the rhythmic dripping of blood off the edge of the kitchen counter. It looked black in the eclipse light. I didn't feel like a monster. I felt like a janitor. I felt like I was doing the most important work in the world. I went back into the hallway. The air was getting colder now, a sudden, unnatural chill that happens when the sun is smothered. I moved to the next door. This one belonged to an older man who collected clocks. I could hear them all ticking in unison through the wood. He was standing by his window, looking out at the street below where people were gathered with their cameras. He didn't hear me enter. The door hadn't been locked. I approached him from behind. The shadows were stretching now, becoming long, spindly fingers that seemed to point right at him. I drove the cleaver into the back of his head. It made a sickening, hollow crack, like a dry log splitting open. He went down hard, his forehead hitting the glass of the window with a dull thud, leaving a smear of grease and blood. I stood over him for a moment, watching the way his fingers twitched against the floorboards. The ticking of the clock seemed to speed up, matching the frantic pounding of my own heart. I was covered in it now. My hands were slick, the wooden handle of the cleaver becoming tacky and difficult to hold. I wiped my palms on my trousers and moved on. The hallway felt miles long. The walls seemed to be leaning inward, the peeling wallpaper looking like dead skin hanging off a giant, concrete beast. In the third unit, there was a woman with a small dog. The dog started barking the moment I stepped over the threshold. It was a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the beautiful silence of the eclipse. I hated it. I found her in the bathroom, putting on makeup, probably getting ready to go out and celebrate the celestial event. She saw me in the reflection of the mirror. Her mouth opened to scream, but I was faster. I swung the cleaver with both hands, catching her across the face. The mirror shattered, raining silver shards over both of us. One of the pieces caught me in the cheek, but I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the heat of her blood as it sprayed across the broken glass. The dog didn't stop barking. I had to handle that, too. I don't like thinking about that part, the way something so small and fragile feels when it stops moving. But the silence had to be maintained. The world was almost dark now. I stepped back out into the hallway just as the totality hit. The world went to deep, terrifying purple-black. Outside, I could hear a distant, collective gasp from the people on the street, followed by a cheer that sounded like it was coming from another planet. But in the hallway, it was absolute. The only light came from the emergency exit sign at the end of the corridor, casting a sickly, flickering red glow over the carpet. The blood on my clothes looked like ink. I stood there, breathing heavily, the air coming out in ragged, visible plumes. I felt a strange sense of peace. I had cleaned 3 units. I had removed the glitches. But then I looked down the hall and saw the doors I hadn't reached yet. There were dozens of them. A whole hive of people, all of them wrong, all of them breathing and pulsing and existing in a space that needed to be empty. The hum started to come back. It wasn't a scream anymore, it was a rhythmic, pulsing vibration that shook the very floor beneath my feet. I realized I wouldn't have enough time. The sun would come back. The false light would return, and I would be caught in the middle of my work. I started to run. I wasn't being quiet anymore. I kicked in the next door, the wood splintering easily under my weight. Inside, a family was gathered around a television. They looked like statues in the dim light. I didn't look at their faces. I didn't want to see them as people. I just saw the red. I saw the way the light from the TV flickered against the spray I was creating. It was like being inside a strobe light in hell. Everything was disjointed, a flash of a blade, a spray of red, a slumped shoulder, a wide, unblinking eye. The iron smell was overwhelming now. It was thick and cloying, sticking to the back of my throat like copper coins. I was slipping on the floors, my feet sliding in the gore I had created. My breath was coming in short, jagged gasps that sounded like a saw cutting through bone. And then, as quickly as it had vanished, the light began to return. A sliver of the sun emerged from behind the moon. It wasn't the amber light from before. It was a harsh, white, unforgiving glare that cut through the hallway like a searchlight. It hit the blood on the walls and made it shimmer. It hit the bodies in the doorways and turned them into undeniable reality. The clarity vanished. The hum in my head stopped instantly, replaced by a deafening, horrific roar of realization. I stood in the middle of the hallway, the cleaver hanging limp in my hand. I looked down at myself. I was unrecognizable. I was painted in the life of the people I had seen in the elevator, the people I had nodded to in the mailroom. The silence was gone. Somewhere downstairs, a siren started to wail. It was a long, low moan that seemed to be pulling the world back together, stitch by bloody stitch. I looked at the door of the last unit I had entered. A small, plastic toy sat in the doorway, half submerged in a dark, cooling puddle. I walked back to my own apartment. I didn't lock the door. I just sat down on my sofa and watched the dust motes. The sun was fully back now, shining brightly, as if nothing had happened. As if the sky hadn't turned into a bruised eye and watched me do it. The hallway is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's the quiet of a house that knows it's full of ghosts. I can hear the sirens getting closer, the tires of the police cars screeching as they pull into the lot. I wonder if they'll see the geometry the way I did. I wonder if they'll understand that I was just trying to fix the light. But as I sit here, feeling the blood dry and tighten on my skin, I know they won't. They'll just see the red. And the worst part, the part that I can't get out of my head, is that the hum is starting to come back. And this time, it's telling me that I missed a spot.
Next story.
The air didn't just get cold, it got heavy. You know that specific kind of stillness right before a massive summer storm hits? It was like that, but worse, because the sky was perfectly clear. I was sitting in my living room, the one with the big bay window that looks out over the tree line, just waiting for the eclipse to reach its peak. Everyone on the news had been talking about the path of totality for weeks, making it sound like some spiritual, once-in-a-lifetime event. I just wanted to see the sky turn dark in the middle of the afternoon. But as the moon started to take that first bite out of the sun, the light didn't just dim, it curdled. Everything outside took on this sickly, polarized hue, like looking at the world through an old, dirty nickel. I noticed the birds first. Or rather, the lack of them. The woods behind my house usually sound like a construction site of chirping and rustling, but it went dead silent. Not a breeze, not a cricket, nothing. I stood up to close the sliding glass door because a sudden, sharp chill was rolling off the grass, and that's when I saw the first one. It was standing right at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor, maybe someone trying to get a better view of the sky, but the proportions were wrong. It was too tall, and its arms hung down past its knees, swaying slightly like they were made of heavy rope. I froze, my hand still on the door handle. The figure wasn't moving its head to look at the sun. It was staring directly at my house. Even from that distance, I could see that its face was a flat, featureless slab of pale, wet-looking skin. As the moon moved further across the sun, the shadows on the ground began to warp. They didn't just stretch, they flickered and multiplied, turning into jagged, shivering lines that seemed to crawl toward my porch. Then came the knocking. It wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the floorboards directly beneath my feet. A slow, rhythmic thud, 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 like something huge was breathing against the foundation of the house. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it actually hurt. That's when I saw the second one. It was pressed right up against the side window of the kitchen. I can't even describe the sound it made without getting sick. It wasn't a voice, but it was trying to be. It was the sound of wet leather being dragged over broken glass. It pressed its face, if you can even call it that, against the pane. The skin was translucent, stretched so tight over a jagged skull that I could see the dark, sluggish pulse of fluid underneath. It didn't have eyes, just two deep, puckered indentations that leaked a thick, black ichor down the glass. It started to scratch. Not a frantic clawing, but a slow, deliberate peeling motion, its long, yellowed fingernails digging into the wooden frame, splintering the grain with agonizing precision. The light outside was a deep, bruised purple now. The sun was nothing but a thin, shimmering ring of fire, and the world felt like it was underwater. I ran to the front door to make sure the deadbolt was thrown, but as I reached for it, the wood began to bulge. Something on the other side was pushing against it with impossible strength. I could hear the fibers of the oak groaning and snapping. I backed into the hallway, tripping over the rug, and watched in absolute horror as a hand, too long, with too many joints, began to force its way through the gap between the door and the frame. The skin on the hand was sloughing off in wet, gray ribbons, revealing raw, red muscle underneath that twitched and pulsed in the dim light. It wasn't just trying to get in, it was falling apart just to reach me. I could smell it then, a cloying, metallic stench of old copper and rotting meat that filled the hallway, making my eyes water and my throat constrict. "Let us see," a voice rasped. It sounded like it was coming from inside my own skull. "The light is gone. Let us in so we can hide." I scrambled back into the bedroom and slammed the door, shoving my dresser in front of it. I could hear them now, dozens of them, circling the house. Their footsteps were heavy and wet, like bags of raw meat being dropped onto the porch. The scratching on the walls was constant, 1,000 tiny, sharp points searching for a weakness in the siding. I looked at the clock on my bedside table, but the numbers were swirling, turning into symbols I didn't recognize. The darkness of the totality had settled in completely. Outside, the world was a void. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a heavy glass lamp, watching the door handle jiggle. Then, the scratching stopped. For a second, I thought it was over. Then the ceiling started to bleed. Huge, dark blossoms of that black fluid began to spread across the white plaster. It dripped down in thick, viscous ropes, sizzling when it hit the carpet. I looked up and saw the plaster cracking, sagging under a massive weight. A face began to push through the ceiling, a wide, distorted mask of agony with a mouth that stretched from ear to ear, filled with rows of needle-thin, translucent teeth. It wasn't biting, it was just hanging there, its jaw unhinged, letting that black bile pour out of its throat and onto the floor. I was backed into the corner, screaming, but no sound was coming out. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The thing in the ceiling was halfway through now, its elongated torso squeezing through the narrow cracks in the joists. I could hear its ribs snapping one by one, a wet, crunching sound that seemed to vibrate in my own chest. It didn't care about the pain. It just wanted to be in the dark with me. The room was almost entirely filled with that suffocating, metallic stench. The creature's fingers, 6 inches long and dripping with gore, were inches from my ankles. I closed my eyes, waiting for the cold grip, waiting for the sensation of those needle teeth sinking into my neck. I could feel the heat radiating off its wet skin, a feverish, unnatural warmth that made my skin crawl. And then, a flash. Even through my closed eyelids, I saw it. A searing, brilliant white light stabbed through the room. It was the diamond ring, the first bead of sunlight peeking out from behind the moon. The scream that tore through the house wasn't mine. It was a collective, harmonized shriek of absolute agony from every direction. It sounded like metal grinding on metal, a high-pitched, vibrating wail that made my ears bleed. I felt a spray of something hot and wet hit my face, and when I opened my eyes, the room was empty. The creature in the ceiling was gone. The black fluid was gone. The dresser was still in front of the door, but the wood wasn't splintered. The hallway was silent. I stood up, my legs shaking so hard I had to lean against the wall for support, and walked out into the living room. The sun was shining. The birds were starting to chirp again, a hesitant, confused sound. The sky was a perfect, clear blue. I looked at the bay window, expecting to see the glass shattered or covered in black ichor. It was spotless. There wasn't a mark on the frame. There wasn't a scratch on the door. I went outside, my heart still racing, looking for any sign that I hadn't just lost my mind. The grass was dry. The trees were still. But as I walked toward the edge of the woods, I stopped. There, in the soft dirt where I had seen the first figure standing, were 2 deep, elongated impressions. They weren't footprints. They were 2 perfect, scorched holes in the earth, smelling of ozone and burnt hair. I don't look at the sky anymore. And when the next eclipse happens, whenever that is, I'm not staying in this house. because I know they didn't just disappear. They're just waiting for the shadow to come back. They're waiting for the light to fail again so they can finish what they started. I can still feel that feverish warmth on my ankle sometimes when the sun goes behind a cloud, and I know, somewhere just beyond the edge of what we can see, they're still scratching.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.